part of our studies of Sheffield, we need to look at how urban change can create challenges. Social and economic challenges, environmental challenges, and then the impact of urban sprawl and commuter settlements. Today we're going to look at social and economic challenges. We're going to look at urban deprivation and how there are inequalities in housing, education, health and employment across the city. You might remember this map from your previous studies, or perhaps the phrase fairness on the 83. The Fairness on the 83 website is about how a 66-minute journey across Sheffield on the 83 bus takes you through areas such as Ecclesall and Burngreave, where the life expectancy is almost 10 years different. Pause the recording here and click on the Fairness on the 83 link and explore the website, looking at how these changes across Sheffield affect people's lives. You might want to create a mind map as you're doing it. If we look at incomes in Sheffield, we can see that there's a pattern. The highest incomes, in this case represented in the darkest blues, are in the west of the city, or more precisely the southwest of the city. Places like Fulwood and Dore and Totley. That probably doesn't surprise you. The lowest wages, between £460 and £560 a week, are over to the east, in places like Darnall. If we look at unemployment, we can see a pattern too. Again, there's that region in the southwest where unemployment is lowest, in this case below 2%. And then over to the east of the city centre, we can see that unemployment is higher with the darker blues, the darkest blue here representing more than 6% unemployment. There are clearly rich and poor in Sheffield, but what impact does that have on people? Well, 25% of children born in Sheffield are born into relative poverty. And 55% of privately rented housing meets the decent home standard, meaning that 45% doesn't. And there are other impacts for Sheffield too. Here we can see self-reported general health from the census of 2011. The census is a questionnaire that comes around to all households in the UK every 10 years, so there's one due in 2021. This map again shows that west to east split. The green colours represent places where under 3.69% of the residents have poor or very poor health. The red areas represent places with over 9.44% of poor or very poor health. And that split is so easy to see. Here's the impact on house prices. Again, you can see a west to east split with the darkest colours over to the west and the lightest colours to the east. And they represent the prices in the different areas of the greater Sheffield region. If we take Fulwood, we can see that the average house price is £300,000 or more. Whereas if we go over to somewhere east of the city centre like Darnall, we can see that house prices are under £75,000. Now you may feel that that's good and that it's good to live in Darnall with cheaper house prices, but it's a function of how desirable the region and the house is. People are willing to pay more for areas that have things like better schools, a better environment, and obviously larger houses with larger gardens, etc. So what about those schools? Well, the Real Schools Guide in 2020 rated Sheffield's best schools as Silverdale, King Egbert's, Tapton, Notre Dame and of course High Stores. Have a look where they are. You can see where the word Sheffield is on the map is the city centre. So again, we're over to the west of the city with all those really high quality schools. And also, we can have a look at where the private schools are. There's a cluster. Birkdale, Westbourne, Sheffield High School, also in the west of the city, where the money is. So here's that in a diagram form. The city centre developed, and around that the factories grew up. The prevailing wind in our country is from the west, and that blows pollution from the west over to the east side of cities. The rich industrialists all bought up land to the west. That land was then sold off for building large houses because they wanted to live in areas with tree-lined avenues, big houses, large gardens, etc., etc. Places like Nether Edge developed in this way. The poorer people had to move over to the other side. They lived in the areas that were polluted, that the industrialists didn't want to live in. And there we developed a lot more smaller houses, terraced housing and back-to-back housing. And of course that's perpetuated today. Those smaller houses tend to attract people on lower wages, and the larger houses to the west tend to attract people on higher wages. And following all of that come things like schools, for example. In Sheffield, the schools to the west of the city were allowed to keep their sixth forms and became very desirable schools, whereas the other schools had their sixth forms taken off them and the children there went on to college. That's meant that people, when they move into Sheffield, if they can afford to, want to move into the areas with the best schools over to the west, and then the people who can't afford to tend to move elsewhere in the city. So it perpetuates this west-east split.